Okay. Minority children often face persistent discrimination and doubt, which inhibits their ability to become confident in themselves and then contribute and succeed in societies. For this reason, we think it's actually crucial that parents of minority children encourage their children to embrace positive stereotypes about themselves. Because first, we think it teaches them to view their ethnicity in a positive light. And second, we're going to advance a broader theory of social change about how minorities can gain a foothold in society with a specific niche and then gain broader acceptance later. Before that, I want to talk a little bit about the model, although I think this is pretty simple. I think, what this looks like, for example, is teaching, Asian American children in the United States that they're smart and diligent because that's a positive stereotype about them. It also means co-opting negative stereotypes and turning them into more positive versions of themselves. So, for example, I think it's good in the United States to teach Black boys and girls, not that they're unruly, but rather that they're powerful. I think, my parents actually taught me that Jews were not stingy, but rather they were frugal. I think in general, we're going to try to focus on character traits and not physical traits, but we're happy really to do either. We just think the character traits are likely to be important too. Okay, with that said, two arguments. First, why this is important for the success of a particular child that the parents are teaching. So I want to be clear about two things. First, there are many types of positive stereotypes, positive attributes that parents could try to inculcate their children with. We're going to try to be specific about why it should be, in particular, ones that are specific to the member or to the minority group that those children are a member of. Second, I also want to say that negative stereotypes about these children are going to exist in either world, and we're going to try to argue that this gives children more of a foothold to combat those negative stereotypes. So, 3 reasons why you should sort of prefer teaching children about these stereotypes as opposed to other ones. First, I think this is just going to increase confidence and resilience against harmful stereotypes later down the line. I think if your parents teach you that you're powerful and that other people's rhetoric against you is racist and harmful, and they start to explain why society thinks this about you and some of the historical stuff, even as a kid, it's more likely that these types of racism that you might be or discrimination that you're likely to face are more likely to bounce off of you. You're more likely to feel like the other people misunderstand you, and you're less likely to feel like you actually have less inherent worth than other individuals. I also think it's just nice to have something positive on your side instead of your parents just telling you oh, everyone's equal, everyone can do whatever they want. I think it's easier to combat negative stereotypes with active pride in who you are and in your ethnicity or in the minority group that you're a part of than it is to think, well, everyone's equal, even though people are always saying negative things about me. Second, I also think that society often expects these type of attributes from minorities, and as a result, it's unlikely that you're going to be able actually subscribing to these particular stereotypes gives you more social or political capital down the line to actually combat negative stereotypes. So an example is if you're an Asian American kid and you're seen as unruly, you're seen as though you're not particularly smart or diligent, it's much harder to break the stereotype that you should be a leader. But if you actually fulfill stereotypes that people expect you to fill, however unfairly that is, you're more likely to have social clout, you're more likely to have political capital to sort of break those expectations. If you're the top of your class, people are more likely to elect you class president. They're more likely to see you as a leader figure. I think lastly, you're just more likely to be successful in convincing other people that you're valuable and they should value you as a person, because you just, by definition, you don't have to overcome those biases that they have against you, right? Like the motion text is that these are positive stereotypes people already have about you. So you don't have to do very much work to convince people that these positive things about you are actually the case. You don't have to convince people that you're smart, or fight uphill against them. I think that's actually important because it means that you're more likely to gain acceptance. You're more likely to have have people support you and make friends, and etc. I'll take closing.
What exactly is the extent of your definition of positive? So, for example, if the stereotype is Latinos make really good people at cleaning lawns, is that a positive stereotype because it gets you jobs?
I think we should be reasonable about this. So if you frame something like that in a positive light, it can sound positive, right? But I think we should let parents use their judgment. And I think that probably doesn't sound like a positive stereotype to me. So yeah, let's just do a gut check on this stuff. And I think if there are edge cases, we can talk about them later. So why does this matter? I mean, I think that these periods are actually formative for children. I think there's lots of evidence that children who don't believe in themselves and whose friends don't believe in them and say negative things about them are just sort of, a little bit, they struggle later in life because they're constantly persuaded by doubt. It's hard for them to take chances because people have told them they're going to fail. It's hard for them to actually devote themselves to something because people told them they won't succeed. I think it's actually really important that kids get a messaging that makes them believe in themselves and makes them, just better people down the line. Second argument, I want to talk about a broader theory of social change. So When you have an influx of a minority group into society, especially one that has sort of racial or xenophobic prejudices, the first thing the society worries about, and usually politicians have an incentive to pander to people to, is that this particular group is going to change the culture of the society in some way, right? Like when Jews, in Germany started to move out of the banking sector and started to move into politics, people worried that they were going to take over Germany, that they were going to, change the culture, that nationalistic German culture that they all loved at that point in time, right? And I think what's important is that I think that usually the way to deal with this is not to confirm those fears and do like basically anything you can, because that usually invites backlash, which is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany, although that is extreme example. I think what's more likely to be successful for minority groups who are trying to gain acceptance is because they're not in power, because unfortunately they are subject to the whims of the majority group to slowly just make their inroads into society. And sure, they can push for things they want, but in a way that doesn't grate so strongly against what the majority thinks they're going to do. And I think this often means coordinated action on the part of minority group to actually fulfill positive stereotypes. An example of this is Asian Americans in the United States in the 1970s. They were incredibly hard, they were incredibly diligent, they were incredibly hardworking, and they're getting much more political mainstream acceptance precisely because of that. People didn't see it, unlike in the 1930s, for example, people didn't see them as taking over the country. They saw them as improving the country, as adding something of value. They didn't see them as a threat. They saw them as an attribute, right? And that was what allowed them to gain more mainstream acceptance later. Obviously, the battle isn't won, but I think the crucial point here is whatever opposition says, all of this, probably liberal rhetoric that we're going to hear coming from them, it doesn't matter because the majority probably doesn't believe this, right? What matters is that, unfortunately, the minority is subject to the whims of the majority. So it's very important to do, to sort of make inroads in society in a way that doesn't invite horrible backlash. I think the impacts of this is, first, you can just often have minorities expelled from a country. So for example, in South Africa, you see that immigrants are just, totally denigrated for taking jobs because they moved into many sectors of the economy extremely quickly and didn't fulfill these kind of positive stereotypes, right? And I think second, even worse, you can often see types of ethnic violence. You can see really, really harmful reactions. I think even if you think opposition is right 60% of the time, the harms on our side are incredibly large because you see active oppression by the majority of the minority. It's really too important to avoid that. Only we do that. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister for their speech. I'd now like to welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Sorry, just give me a second. Timer. Can everyone hear me? It all good? Yeah? Okay. Panel, I think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the imbalances of power and the ways that white supremacy upholds, I would say, positive stereotypes that the opening government has missed. That means that they are necessarily in this case. Points of concern, the first talking about impacts as organizing, the second talking about impacts to the individual and their relationships with their parents. Then I will be doing a lot of implicit rebuttal, anything else that will come out at the end. Okay, first talking about impact to society, because I think what the problem that opening government fundamentally missed is that racial, this is going to impact not just your own ethnic group. This is going to be embracing positive stereotypes also impacts racial and ethnic groups that aren't your own. So positive stereotypes are necessarily based on racial hierarchies. And by buying into positive stereotypes, it necessarily means to a certain extent that you're, number one, buying into white supremacy, but also number two, buying into anti-Blackness. Why do I think this? Because positive stereotypes, specifically those that benefit Asian diasporas, often are linking them within academia and hyper intellectualization. Positive stereotypes linked to Black people also often have to do with more with their physical prowess. So if you see things like the idea that more people who are Black are necessarily funneled into sports, or things that it's physical.
Did we lose them?
Yeah, I'm on a call with them. I'll check.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, time is stopped at 1:38. So.
I'm gonna hope the answer is yes, because I can't really see anyone. I just logged in from my mobile device.
Okay, that's good.
But I'm gonna go ahead with this speech.
So you were, just to clarify, you were at 1:38, and the last thing I heard was people buying into their physical prowess funneled into sports. That's the exact line.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. If I could get time signals, because I'm going to be looking, or like just time indication, I'm going to be looking at my mobile. I'll try to continue the speech. Okay, so I think what this means is that given that Black folks are more likely to be linked directly into their physicality, and I think that Asian folks are more likely to be linked towards intellectualization, and I think that similarly, a lot of people coming from Jewish diasporas are linked towards wealth, that all of these things come either from a view that white supremacy has created for racialized people or for minorities, or has necessarily come from the ways that they can benefit that society. Why do I think that this is really harmful? First, I think that individualized and racialized groups buy into anti-Blackness and white supremacy for their own benefit, which means they have less of a vested interest in taking it down. I think that this is specifically true when you think about the way that a lot of people coming from Asian diasporas have really hard time sometimes buying into the idea that racism exists because they have benefited from positive stereotypes. I think that this also increases lateral violence between people of color and Black people in the ways that they organize and the way that they work within coalitions. I think that it's interesting that when opening government talks to you about the way that you should try to assimilate and you should try to be non-threatening to society, I think that that is exactly what positive stereotypes do. It tells minorities and it tells people of color and it tells Black people that they should try to be non-threatening in the way that they advocate for their rights. And I think that that means that when people are organizing, specifically people who are racialized minorities who face real structural problems, they are told that they should be non-threatening. And I think that that idea of non-threateningness is oftentimes projected more onto Black folks because these same positive stereotypes that opening government has told us, things about Black people being strong, are so easily conflated to Black people being violent or Black people being unable to be hurt. I think then that that is inherently harmful. I'll take that POI in just a second. I think that the last harmful impact that isn't talked about enough, and probably for this exact reason, is that people from Asian diasporas and people from Jewish diasporas are less likely to recognize racism and white supremacy in their own communities and less likely to have it recognized externally, which means that because they are the recipients of these positive stereotypes, people are less likely to take it seriously when they say, hey, I face racism, hey, I face harmful negative stereotypes. This is a real problem and I need it to stop. Even though I believe that open government, governments having a real
I don't think that Asian people getting worse grades is going to make white people less racist against Black people, because the people that create racial hierarchies are not necessarily the ones making crucial decisions in this motion.
Okay, so I simply think that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of my point. I'm not saying that white people will necessarily stop treating Black people bad if Asian people get worse grades. I'm saying that it is harmful for Asian people to internalize the idea that they are intellectually superior, because the fact of the matter is that positive stereotypes come from racial hierarchies, which means that if you necessarily believe that Asian people are intellectually superior or more predisposed
exposed to academia, you have to also necessarily buy into a certain extent that other people are worse at that. I think that means you internalize those positive stereotypes about yourself, but also internalize negative stereotypes about other people, meaning that you reinforce anti-Blackness and you increase lateral violence. And I think that even if I am not talking about white gays, which I actually am not right now, I'm talking about coalition building between people of color and why this is harmed when people internalize racial stereotypes and positive stereotypes. Second point, impacts of the individual and the relationships. I think that an individual who is being told to embrace these stereotypes only gets the benefits that Gov wants to tell you exist if that they embrace them fully. Why do I think that this is important to know? Because I think in the vast majority of cases, people are going to struggle to some extent with embracing these stereotypes. I think maybe they'll struggle, like if they're saying an Asian person because they just like do not like school or because they do not excel at school. Not everyone who is Asian, is naturally predisposed towards academia, which means if you fail to live up to these positive stereotypes, you feel like you not only have failed as an individual, but you have also failed your community. I think that's harmful. But I would say then that in every other case, which is probably going to be the vast majority of the cases, because even if you're not predisposed towards this talent, I think that you're probably still going to be pushed really hard to do this by your parents and pushed really hard to do this by your community, which means that you're going to have to choose between resentment or estrangement. Why do I think that those are the two choices? Because if you continue to go down the path that your parents are necessarily pushing down or necessarily telling you is the best path for you, and if you do not agree with that path, you are going to necessarily resent them to some extent. If you choose to reject that path, and if you choose to say that I want to do something completely different that doesn't necessarily buy into this positive stereotype, you are necessarily choosing to distance yourself to some extent from your family, to necessarily choose to distance yourself from your community to some extent. That means that you now have created fractures between interpersonal relationships between parents and children, but also between people and their communities. Consider how it must feel to be, say, like grow up in a house where you are told that you have to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, and you choose to pursue the arts, even if that is something that makes you happy, even if that is a thing that you might actually be predisposed to be the most talented at, you now have to choose between, say, disappointing your family, disappointing your community, because that is what that positive stereotype does. It necessarily enforces one path and one way of living your life that you cannot break out of. The vast majority of people are not going to want to pursue this path. The last thing I would say is that this means you're probably more likely to suffer from mental health issues that you don't have support for from your community or from your family, which is incredibly important because it means that the people that should be supporting you most are not giving you that support. Final ideas on some of the concepts that government brought. The idea of social change and backlash. I think that
Sorry, that is your time. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much to that speaker. And I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, can people hear me? Cool. I wanted to start this speech by saying that societal change or change in perception is not something that comes in an instant or without the change of individual hearts and minds or without the change of individual interactions. In the absence of opposition's framing as to how societal change is going to be brought, I don't think they're winning the round by simply saying societal change is more important, because where societal change starts is where individuals change the ways in which they view people, individuals change the ways in which they interact with people. That's what we get on opening government, and that's why it's so crucial that we're already winning the framing of this round. I want to talk about two things in this speech. First, I want to talk about what happens to the individual child and what kinds of interactions become more valuable to them. And then I'll move on to the societal perspective. And here's where I'll address most of opening opposition's arguments. All rebuttal will be integrated. So firstly, on the individual child, I want to be very clear about two key points of the comparative. One, society will expect these positive stereotypes from individuals anyway. The fact that they are stereotypes literally by definition mean that most individuals that you interact with in society will expect them to some extent, whether it's subtle, whether it's implicit, or whether it's explicit racism. That means that these stereotypes exist in subtle forms anyway. And the question is, if society is going to impose these stereotypes on individuals anyway, what kinds of solutions can you take in order to assess how you should interact with that particular society? Here are three reasons why, given this particular comparative and framing, we are winning out. One, in the instances in which society enforces these stereotypes anyway and tells you that these are the positive positive character traits that you should have, and when your parents are telling you an entirely different story that gives you doubt about what kinds of strengths you have and what kinds of things are things that make you valuable, because your parents are telling you an entirely different story from the things that society has told you all your life, and from things that society will judge you about, and from things that society uses as a metric to judge you. That means that it's far more likely that it actually interacts with opening opposition's claim about relationship with parents, because it's far more likely that it's going to strain relationships with your parents. It's far more likely that you don't have the self-confidence that is necessary because you don't necessarily know what makes you a positive individual. But secondly, and more importantly, we would say that particularly because society will expect these stereotypes anyway, this is the one thing, or the couple of traits that make, in the instances in which parents do embrace it, this is the thing that most people in society, as well as your parents, that is both your familial and social connections, will accept as a positive trait for you. That means that it makes it much more easier for you to conform to these things, as opposed to trying to fulfill the expectations of both sides, because oftentimes trying to fulfill both expectations is unreasonable, and that's what makes people makes it harder for individuals to grapple with societal stereotypes. That means that given that these stereotypes will exist anyway, and we think it's unfortunate that these stereotypes do exist, but for the perspective of that individual child, it's much more easier, and it's much more better for the self-confidence and the development of that particular child for these particular stereotypes to be embraced. The second thing I want to talk about is, in either world, parents are going to encourage some kind of positive attributes, because no parent is going to be oh, you should be a dumb person. That's not the way in which parenting works. Given that that's the case, I want to talk about why you should embrace these particular positive attributes and not some random attribute that opening opposition still hasn't clarified. One, we would say that not having those particular positive stereotypes that society is likely to expect from you is a huge cost to you as an individual. Why is that the case? For every interaction that you have with a teacher, for every interaction that you have with a parent of another friend, it's more likely that they're going to expect these from you anyway. And in the event that you don't have these traits, the cost for that is huge. That is, an Asian American person not being diligent is a larger cost than a white individual who's not diligent. That means that the cost for you is much larger, and therefore it's not only is the cost large, but it's also the cost is things that will impact you into the future. I.e., if it strains your relationship with the teacher, or if you don't have friends because people are because people don't view you in a positive light, it's much less likely that you get any opportunities into the future, which we think are important. This doesn't happen, or is much less likely to happen under their side of the house. Secondly, we tell you that these positive attributes are just easier to embrace, because there's a lower bar for the kinds of things that you need to do in order to address it, and therefore it's just easier for that child to make it and utilize these positive attributes. I'll take a POI from closing.
Why can the reasonable alternative not just be that parents support you in your choices? This is what parents do all the time. Ask you what you want to be in life and then support you and help you guide you through it.
I'm not sure if that's a reasonable comparative, because on both sides, parents expect you to do things anyway. But nonetheless, even if it were true, we would say that this is a better comparative, because parents not taking an action or not taking a step just means that children are likely to conform to societal stereotypes anyway. I'm not sure what CEO's contribution here is. I want to do a bit of weighing on why the individual child is important. One, it is the primary obligation of the parent. That is, having self-confidence in your formative years influences you in your later years. We think that that's something that parents do have an obligation to make sure that that happens. But secondly, and more importantly, it is a prerequisite for societal change. There is no automatic button that presses and says there's broad societal change now. That's not going to happen in the absence of individual interactions, individual relationships, and lives changing. And we change the lives of individuals by making the children from racial minorities have much better lives. That's the way to get societal change. Opening opposition does not have a way to do so. Second, I want to talk about societal perspective. Opening opposition mostly talks about how embraces racial hierarchies. One, we're not saying that we should focus on physical traits or unattainable traits. If you're a bad athlete, it's probably bad to say that you should be a good athlete just because you're black. I don't think that, I think that's a very uncharitable expectation you expect opening government to have. But secondly, and more importantly, we would say that their argument about how this makes people less likely to recognize racism and internalize stereotypes about other people isn't necessarily true. Because why is that the case? The ways in which people teach their kids that is that they frame it to the kids that this is some kind of misunderstanding. That is, society has these negative stereotypes for you, but there are like ways of viewing it in a positive light, and that society is misunderstanding you. In this process, nowhere in this process is there like a racial hierarchy that says that you need to make sure that you're better than another minority race at this particular thing. I don't think that's the expectation that's necessary for parents to have. But secondly, we would also say that racial hierarchies exist anyway, given that the way in which society drives like the racial division that exists between the different racial minorities is through the existence of racial hierarchies. We would say that society will expect different things from different races all the time. The only question is, how can each race, how can each racial minority be able to change societal's perception about this? And we think that we are much better in changing the hearts and minds of individuals, given that when individuals are in positions of power as a result of the fact that they have some of the societal positive characteristics that people expect from you, people are much more likely to listen to you. We're much more likely to change the lives of individuals, but also change the minds of how people view you. Very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the opening half of this debate.
Okay, everyone can hear me? Yes, excellent. Okay. I want to start the speech off with two broad clarifications. The first is that stereotypes are complex. I think it was extremely lazy of opening government to say, oh, we're not talking about the stereotypes such as against Latin Americans that CO brings up in a POI, but never give us a characterization as to what stereotypes we're talking about. Like the one example we get is that Asians are studious, but they never engage with the fact that that's actually an extremely complex stereotype that also coincides with a bunch of negative stereotypes, like that Asians are quiet, that Asians are antisocial, that Asians don't know how to lead, right? Like there is never an engagement with what these stereotypes actually look like. Literally, at one point, opening government just says, the stereotype is that you are powerful. Like, that's never what the stereotype is. It's always more complicated than that, and they never engage with the complexity of what that actually looks like. Second clarification, opposition bench does not need to solve racism. It truly shocks me to my core. The government says, oh, you can't just push a button to get broad societal change. Therefore, we should do this really fucked up thing that means you have to assimilate into a mainstream, right? Like, obviously, if we are able to prove that this is actively harmful to racial justice, particularly to societal justice at a broader level that includes not just communities that benefit from positive stereotypes, we obviously can still win this debate. Harar and I have both, I hope, will prove to you that this is actively harmful not only to other racial communities, but also communities that are targeted by positive stereotypes. I think that that's more than enough. I don't know that we need to give a counterfactual as to how we also achieve societal change. If we prove that they're actively harmful and that coalition building, notably a great metric for societal change, is actively harmed by this, I think we can still win this debate. Okay, 3 themes for you. Firstly, impacts on other groups, namely the Black community. Secondly, on impacts on your own group. And finally, on the individual. So, impacts on other groups. First of all, Harar explains to you quite clearly that race is often built on a relationship to whiteness and specifically white supremacy. The response to this is, oh, we're obviously not endorsing stereotypes that Black people are just athletic. Yes, that is true, but the issue is that even when you endorse stereotypes such as Asians are studious or whatever, like some group is smart or hardworking, that means that you are inherently saying that other groups are less than, right? Oftentimes, your race is defined by your relationship to whiteness, right? All of us are defined by our relationship to a white supremacy and a white default, and by saying that you are different or you are better or you are approximating whiteness more, notably a very common element of positive stereotypes, it means that those other groups are inherently harmed and they are pushed to areas such as, oh, Black people should stick to athletics or physical labor. That means that also people are very likely to say things that, like, why can't Black people act like other communities, act like Asian communities, right? You often see this erasure of historical context. People say, oh, like, look at X community, they've been able to make themselves in the US. Why do we still see Black people suffering so much? Obviously, it's because they're inherently worse, right? That kind of rhetoric is often weaponized against other marginalized communities, and that is what Harar was talking about. Really disappointing that it wasn't engaged on across the bench. Suddenly that ended up being actively weaponized against these people. It's not only that this happens from white people and people in white supremacist positions, but it also means that other people of color endorse it. Like, there's such a broad amount of like Asian against Black racism, like other communities, like discriminating against like Indigenous communities, against Black communities, that is extremely common, and it often is endorsed specifically by positive stereotypes. Literally, like, my uncles are like, look, I made it in this country, why can't other communities? Like, that is so common amongst Asians, and it's so it's still extremely harmful, right? If opening government wants to talk about relationship building and the ability for minorities to pull themselves up by Asians like integrating into the mainstream and then pulling up the other groups, like, that doesn't happen when you literally tell your kids your race is why you're better than people. You don't need to work with other POCs because it's not actually white supremacy that's the issue. It's that we're better, right? Hart tells you that this is actively harmful to coalition building, notably one of the best ways to achieve actually effective racial justice, right? I think that we can just stand on that as our metric to achieve racial justice. I'm not gonna like explain exactly what that coalition building would look like because I think that's, I don't have enough time for that in this speech and it's not super relevant. Secondly though, I think we talked about why you specifically have societal obligations as a person of color, but also just as a human being, right? Like, if we're able to prove to you that this is actively harmful to groups that are not your own, you should still probably care. And then, actually, first I'll take closing.
Okay, so I don't understand why the framing needs to be you're good in school because you're Asian, as opposed to being good in school is a good thing that you should embrace. And the reason you're good at it could be any number of things.
Bro, that's not a positive stereotype. You can still say your kid is good at school and completely remove the race of it. Like, I would love to tell my kid that they're good at school and that they're smart and that they're cool, right? Like, but the moment you say it has something to do with you being Asian or it has something to do with your race, that's the stereotype. If closing government is just going to be like, encourage your kids and don't mention the race part, like, please, like, that's not the motion. Okay, impacts on your own group then, right? Opening government says this gives you confidence and self-worth. First of all, a couple of responses to this. First of all, this doesn't need to come from stereotypes. I think that oftentimes when they talk about being a bulwark against oppression, that is true, but you can teach your kids to be proud of their culture outside of those stereotypes, right? You can say, hey, like, embrace your South Asian heritage, embrace the cultural practices you have, you should be proud to be Sri Lankan, but not that like Sri Lankans are inherently more studious or smarter, right? Like, that doesn't need to come from stereotypes. I think we get the same impacts. Secondly, then, it increases the incidence of negative stereotypes. And that goes back to the idea that these stereotypes are often complex, right? Because when you say Asians are studious, it often means that people also see them as antisocial, as quiet, as docile, right? All of those things coincide. And when you increase the incidence of positive stereotypes, even at a personal level, like, if I'm willing to say to my friends, like, oh my God, like, I'm Asian, I constantly study a ton, like, that probably means that they're also more willing to mock me for being Asian and mock me for being antisocial. I'll take opening government.
You say it's good for coalition building. People in society will impose these stereotypes and impose different positive stereotypes on different races anyway. How does this enable coalition building?
Because you're not endorsing them. I think that people, if you can also talk about your relationship to white supremacy and say, hey, society is pushing these stereotypes on all of us, that is actively harmful. And if you actively reject positive stereotypes saying that is anti-Black, that is anti-Indigenous, that still allows coalition building because you're not endorsing the stereotypes yourself. Okay, then on pushing into the mainstream, which is a big opening government point, like, note that this literally just is assimilation, right? When you're saying that you should use the stereotypes weaponized against you to help you, that often means that's going to be weaponized against other members of your group. This increases the incidence of things like accent bias, of things like anti-immigration status, right? Like, all of those things are far more likely. I also think their point about like stopping these stereotypes about people like invading your country, like weird comparisons to Nazi Germany, like that's literally what comes from positive stereotypes. A lot of the time white people are really mad that Asians are coming to steal their jobs. I think that positive stereotypes often make that literally more harmful. Finally, on the individual, like, we tell you that it's actively harmful both to children in terms of putting them into their own boxes and harms help seeking, sorry. Opening government says that you should try to fulfill both expectations and that you should talk to your kids about those stereotypes. We agree that it probably harms the relationship if you never discuss those stereotypes with your children, but you can discuss them and still reject them, right? I think you should probably talk to your children about how they're going to experience those stereotypes, but you don't have to do it by saying that they should endorse them or agree with them. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the dialogue and also the opening half now to the member of government.
So I think what's missing this debate is a comparative understanding of the way these stereotypes affect people, absent any sort of intervention from parents. Because I think that there is a profound discomfort that comes from fulfilling like stereotypes about your background that is especially bad in the context of positive stereotypes. So I'm going to go into my extension and then do refutation at the end. Firstly, like our broad extension is about stereotype threat and the limitations of individual freedom and sort of self-expression that come from positive stereotypes and how we're able to combat that. So we'd say that absent intervention from parents, there is a profound discomfort in fulfilling stereotypes, even when those stereotypes are positive. So for example, Jewish people will feel uncomfortable expressing frugalness, even when that might be like a good thing to do fiscally, or Asian people feel that their good grades make them conform to a stereotype and reduce them to their ethnicity in a way that is deeply dehumanizing. And the impact of this is that the pressure is either that like people are limited in their ability to conform to those things even when they want to, because you resist fulfilling a stereotype for fear that you're worsening the perceptions of their background, or it leads to like discomfort when you do behave in those ways because you feel that like you're essentially limiting your entire personality down to your like ethnic background. The reason why this is uniquely bad for positive stereotypes is that it penalizes you for doing good things. Getting good grades is no longer a reflection of your achievement, but an affirmation of the majority group's assumptions about you, what you're capable of in your background, in a way that like is like takes away from you something that should be a positive achievement that you should be able to celebrate, right? This may not harm everyone, right? So like not everyone from these backgrounds will necessarily care about these specific positive attributes, whatever they are for the specific ethnic background. But given that positive stereotypes tend to encompass things that most people care about, right? Most people care about getting good grades. Most people care about being fiscally responsible or any number of things. These are things that most people will, to some extent, strive for, which means the impact of being penalized by the feeling of conforming to a stereotype and fulfilling assumptions about you and your ethnicity that come from trying to achieve something that most people care about trying to achieve is something that limits most people from these backgrounds that have like positive stereotypes built up about them. So the way that we make this existing problem comparatively better is by embracing the positivity of conformity that otherwise would be like uncomfortable, right? So the idea is that like embrace doesn't necessarily mean that we tell people that you'll be like a good accountant because you're Jewish, but it means we tell them that wanting to be an accountant is a good thing that maybe they should be proud of, right? So this is where I think OO is wrong, right? It's not necessarily that you frame it as being a comparative thing about your race. I think perhaps knowing that people will be taught these things about themselves through media, through their peers, through their teachers and stuff like that, you preempt those things, right? And obviously this isn't just something that you're like telling your kid they should be good in school as everyone does, but given the specific stereotypes that exist about your child's ethnic background, you tailor the things you're going to tell them to embrace based on those assumptions. But the way you explain it to the child doesn't necessarily need to be based on that. So it's clearly taking into account the existing stereotypes and framing your like reinforcement based on that. But you don't necessarily need to say you're going to be smarter because you're like Jewish or Asian or whatever. I don't really think we need to defend parents being like explicitly racist towards their kids. Rather saying, look, when you get good grades, like you should feel good about that. You should feel that you're making your community look positively, right? Note that the impact here isn't necessarily that the community is actually seen in a positive light, because I don't know that we're going to be able to solve.
I feel like the first half of their extension is better than this justification.
Oh, sorry.
You unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I lost track of what I was saying. Oh yeah.
Sorry, no. You can. I'll give you 20 seconds or 10 seconds extra.
My bad. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll take top half actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So could you explain, like, obviously any parent will say congrats for getting a good grade. Like, where does the connection to your race come from?
Yeah, so like I know that because my kid is like Asian, let's say, that there's a degree of discomfort that comes with getting good grades and feeling that they conform to a stereotype about them that in the eyes of like white people reduces them to their ethnic background. So knowing that this will be something that they will face, I specifically choose to explain to them before they even go to school that, for example, that would be like a good thing to achieve, that if they do that, they're making their community look good, that they should feel proud of that, so that there is a pre-existing sense of pride that counteracts the like sting of conformity that would otherwise exist towards fulfilling positive roles, right? So that the existing pressure that actually probably exists against fulfilling these stereotypes now like is counteracted by an equal pressure from parents that is specifically tailored based on what those pressures are going to be, such that they are comparatively more comfortable in doing things that are positive than they otherwise would be. I hope that's like reasonably clear. Yeah. So I think that this means that you like get better, like, I don't know, treatment. I would also say that like, given that when parents are the ones teaching these stereotypes, they're able to change the way they exist. So I think it's true that often these stereotypes come with other negative things, like studiousness in Asian people is associated with like being quiet and unsocial and not being leaders. I think that this is because the stereotypes are often not taught through those like minority groups themselves. I think when you take a role in the way the stereotype is formed and presented in the mind of people for whom it affects, I think you have more power to shape what that means. What does it mean to be studious, right? Being, for example, good in school doesn't necessarily just mean getting good SAT scores, but it also means being a good leader and stuff like that. I think the fact that you as a parent, because you take some role and empowerment in the way this narrative is taught to your child, you can shape in a way that is comparatively more positive, even if it's going to be negative on both sides. Let's take back half, because I'm supposed to take two.
Okay, so your extension is premised on the idea that parents are powerful and can shelter you from society. Why can they not shelter you into making other choices by the same logical like extension as well?
No, I'm just saying that people care about what their parents think about their actions to some extent. They also care about what society thinks about their actions. If society thinks like one thing and parents think another thing, being able to counteract that to some extent is an important thing. The other thing is that parents have some powerful role in their child, even if it's not complete. People still learn things from the media, but if parents are able to supplement that in a way that's powerful, it's still able to create a comparatively better stereotype that is able to like at least shape their behavior in a way that is comparatively more positive. In terms of refutation to OO assumes that teaching these things are necessarily comparative in a way that's negative. I don't think this is true. Like when people say Black Lives Matter, it isn't necessarily a comparative statement, but is emphasizing one thing is specifically being good. You're emphasizing that your child is going to be good in school. Maybe you say it's because of the race, but it's not necessarily a comparative thing. I don't think this is necessarily the case. I also think their argument is sort of predicated that like teaching the stereotype needs to be linked to white supremacy. I think that maybe this could be true at like a broad level, but on an individual level where a parent's just like, it is a good thing you got good grades, it makes like people like you look good. I don't know that someone necessarily internalizes that as being comparative. And to the extent that they do, I think people are already probably going to be racist, so the marginal benefit is minimal compared to the massive impact on someone's behavior that I think is far more concrete and likely to happen. And so for that reason, I'm very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you very much to the member of government. Just a gentle reminder to please mute yourself unless you're seeking or asking a POI. Thank you. Moving on to the member of Obna.
Can you hear me? Can you just confirm that you can hear me? Cool. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this debate is messy. I'll first clear it up and clear the comparative and why we will win with that comparative. And then I'll run two extensions. First, why this is likely to be bizarre and oppressive to children. Second, why you're not likely to achieve the social change that government wants, and I'll engage with it. First, I agree with the other sides. This narrative is promoted by alternative mechanisms like pop cultures, role models within your community already. What is the role of parents within such a circumstance? I think both gov teams have conceded that parents have immense power in shaping how you feel about that norm, i.e. they can control your interpretation of it, your likely actions of it, and create plans for it. There are two things I'd like to note. Number one, if parents are powerful in this way, they're also likely to be able to be powerful in an average parental sense, which is to say they can ask you, what do you like? What are your passions? What are your preferences? And after you say, I prefer X career path, they can help you shape that career path and shroud you from all of the societal pressure that you face toward that career path. We're not adding analysis here, we're using gov analysis to prove this. Second, let's say that you want to choose this career path as well. It is unlikely that parents will oppose it. If an African American wants to become a basketball player, they've already seen their community succeed, they probably have a neighbor who's really good at basketball, they're also less likely to be antithetical to your choice. The premise is we want you to choose. But third, the uniqueness is we'd rather open up fields about other areas of your choice before forcing you into one. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, this is something that is crucial. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the extension. Why do we think parents are likely to use this narrative very terribly in a way in which they explain why this is something they have to pursue? Notice, Gov cannot fiat that they have a model of how parents explain. OG explicitly says we will leave it to parents to decide how they will explain it to children. we think parents will do a really terrible job. 3 structural reasons for this. Number 1, most of these parents are first-generation immigrants. This is because they're likely to be moving into these countries new, so they're likely to be risk-averse and are likely to double down on any choice that they're enforcing. It is unlikely to happen when they leave that choice to children and are supportive of the choices they make. When they make the choices themselves, they're likely to double down. That's why Asian parents are more of tiger parents. It's not a stereotype, it's the truth. I'm an Asian child myself. The second is, oftentimes these parents derive self-worth from their own community rather than from the majority community, i.e. they don't see what white children are doing as a sense of self-worth, but they see their own families and their own neighbors as a derivation of self-worth. So they're likely to pressure you more when you're competing within your own community rather than when you're competing with someone that they already know has privileges. Number 3, you often want to compensate your own failure. That's the first-generation immigrant narrative. I sacrificed for you. So the moment you choose, you feel a sense of entitlement where they have to compensate for your sacrifice. The impact of this is simple. You are likely to add extra pressure that compounds the terrible harms of society. This directly engages CG and takes them out of the debate. Second, you're also likely to set generally higher expectations than norms, i.e. even if you do 85% well, that's not good enough for this parent. They're likely to set a threshold of 88 or 90. I get scolded for getting 92 in math because I'm from the subcontinent. I think that's how standards are set. This is why, unless CG Whip magically proves that parents will do this well, this will win us this debate anyway, because we just proved that everything they stand for is dependent on parents doing it well. We think they do it badly. We already won the debate. Why is this likely to lead to failure more so than success? Before that, I'll take opening.
Yeah, if your assumption is that most parents are going to be pretty bad at parenting, why can opt fiat that parents will do like letting people choose in a good or positive manner?
Oh, because that's where all your biological inclinations of caring about them come in, and you don't become irrational where you think you know better than the child. The moment you trust a child's choice, you're likely to set navigational patterns for it. The moment you think you know better and the choice has already been made, you're likely to set plans that enforce it. There are liberal Indian parents as well. The vast majority of them go cuckoo when they get conservative. I think what we need to explain is why this child is likely to fail at getting success based on this metric. Number 1, a child often doesn't have the individual capabilities. Like, there's no positive stereotype that is based on truth. It is often based on cultural norms, i.e. most people have a cultural norm of being hardworking within Jewish societies. That's why you think they're better at being bankers, not because there's a truth to their genetics, like, you know, manipulation by Jewish people are automatically good at, you know, calculating finance. So a vast number of Chinese kids might just not be good at math. Number 2, a child might have individual passions that are different, i.e. often the child has other interests that they get exposed to. The harms are simple. Number 1, you often feel like a perpetual failure, especially when there are continuous standards that are being set at a higher threshold when you can't meet your standards that the parents set. Number 2, even if you get success, that success is meaningless because it's only done to satisfy your parents. If your parents don't smile and are not happy for a long amount of time, which is unlikely based on the characterization I proved, you just feel no meaning in achieving that success. You just feel like you're running a hedonic treadmill. Number 3, we think you often don't feel strongly attached to your identity the moment you fail. This is because you feel less African American than the other people in your neighborhood. So what you're likely to do is you're likely to have your own version of African Americanhood that is, like, you know, completely unregulated and not controlled by your parents, because you need to create an identity for yourself. That's where African Americans start joining gangs, because they stop trusting their parents to shape their identity and create African American identities from the gangs and what their neighbors who are opting out like them shape their identity through. That's where worse and more oppressive kinds of identities are created, when you don't trust your parents and you feel like they don't understand you but are enforcing the community and their ideals onto you. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so I don't think it's true that societal assumptions from like white people that Asian students will like get good grades encourages that behavior. I think if anything, it discourages it, at which point doing that just like conforms to expectations that white people have about you, which probably feels kind of shitty. I'm not sure then why countervailing pressures actually like add together as opposed to
completely asserted that with no logical analysis. I hope the whip has analysis, and then my whip will respond. Social change, 2 layers of analysis under this. Number 1, your entire life, you've seen your community as the other. This is because you've always competed with your own community, and that is why you always see see them as your other, and you've never competed and been hostile to another community because you were never competed for the same industry. This is why you're less likely to collectivize and are less likely to have collective action, bargaining in a world in which you're all competing against each other for the same pool. Unless they somehow fiat that individualism is removed, they're not getting this collectivization for social change. Number two, stereotypes can be weaponized. I think Gov agrees to this, where African Americans, because they're good at being athletes, are interpreted as being aggressive. The frame is, whatever your parents say is immaterial. The right-wing media has a lot of bad incentives to interpret it negatively. So the only way to change that is by removing all stereotypes altogether, where African Americans are not seen as aggressive for any reason whatsoever. And the only way to do that is by making sure African Americans are present in all industries, not just basketball and sports. As long as the right-wing media exists, this will continue. We think we clearly win.
Okay, thank you very much to the member of OP. I'd now like to welcome the final speaker from Gov Bench, the Government Whip.
Okay, I realized I was muted, sorry. Okay, so panel, all speakers in this debate agree to a large extent that the stereotypes are going to exist regardless. So really the only question that matters is, are parents like a uniquely good actor to add to the already very large subset of people who are already teaching you what these stereotypes are? Most of my whip is going to boil down to that. The first question I want to pose is, are those stereotypes intrinsically good? And are parents do they have the ability to teach it in a good way? And then the second question is going to be on whether or not parents are a good addition to the external factors that are going to be pushing these stereotypes regardless. All clash will be integrated, although I'll do some explicit weighing at the end. Okay, first question then, are these stereotypes intrinsically good? I would note that closing off, a lot of their extension is predicated on the fact that a lot of these stereotypes, A, might be taught in a bad way, i.e. parents might teach your child that you have to be good at math even if you're not. And the second thing they say is you might not be able to fulfill them. You might have other passions. You should just ask your kid what their passions are. So a few things. The first thing I would note that oftentimes these stereotypes are a lot broader than what OP has made it out to be, but it is usually in fact the external majority group that pushes them that narrows them down to a very small subset, i.e. the broad stereotype is that maybe Asian people are studious, or maybe that Jewish people are fiscally responsible, but that usually gets narrowed down when it is not taught from the context of minority actors, but is solely taught from the hands of the majority, i.e. when you as a parent stop teaching it altogether and you let the media take over and you let movies make stereotypes of Asian people studying hard for the SAT when they're in school, you enable that majority group to control all of what the stereotype means. This means every single time OO and CO claim that the stereotype might be come across in a negative implication or one of which you can't fulfill, we're actually able to co-opt those benefits on closing Gov. How do we do this? The first thing we tell you is when it was actually the second part of Jacob's extension, which is that you as a parent have the unique ability to reclaim these stereotypes and broaden the scope of where they exist, i.e. you can do what CO wants and ask your kid, what do you want your career path to be? And then you can reclaim the stereotype and show how it shapes into that, right? So if your kid wants to be a musician, you could teach them how studiousness will help them become a musician. You could explain that getting good grades is actually an empowering thing, will help you down the line. So you as a parent have the unique ability to have those interpersonal conversations with your child and shape the stereotype into a positive of how it will help them on a unique individual level down the line. This is why you're able to reclaim stereotypes in a positive way, and this is why you're actually able to broaden the scope. So at the end of this clash, I've proven to you why it is that we're able to flip the off-bench case, which is that they're bad, and how you as a parent can actually broaden that, and how on the comparative, they're still going to exist, but they're going to be more narrowed down in a more harmful way. The second question then is, are you as a parent good at pushing these stereotypes? So a lot of what we get coming out of closing off is this idea that parents are maybe going to teach them in a way that is bad for their children, or in a negative lens, or maybe they're going to be tiger parenty in the ways that you teach them. So I would note here that opening government largely just asserts the claim that they're going to exist regardless, but actually never fills in the link as to why parents teaching them as a uniquely positive mechanism for how you're able to like get these good stereotypes across. So the first thing I'm going to prove here is why it is that actually in a world without your parents teaching you, it becomes a lot harder to embrace the positive attributes you can get out of a stereotype. So the mechanism that Jacob gives you here is that oftentimes fear of fulfilling a stereotype is bad for you, even if that stereotype itself is good. So even if it is implicitly good for you to get good grades, which we know is actually good for everyone. So it's unclear to me that in ops world, they want to push people not to get good grades, or they want to push people not to be fiscally responsible. We'd say the fear of that being stereotypical only by a majority group is what makes it harder for you to fulfill them. CO says they want analysis here. Well, oftentimes stereotype threats are very real and measurable. So like when Jewish people are taught that they're like cheap Jews, they're scared to be like stingent because that is flipped into negative context, as opposed to you as a parent teaching your child that being fiscally responsible is a good thing, and it is good to be like not spend a lot and to like be minimalistic in the ways that you're purchasing things, right? So this is why we're able to actually flip the narrative on stereotype threat, and means that it's easier to fulfill it. Why does this matter? Because CO comes up in extension, and CO tells you that parents are often going to push it down your throats and feed into the status quo narrative that these stereotypes are something you ought to do, and CO frames this as it's going to compound. Like society tells you have to do it and you'll feel bad, and you as a parent also tell you. But what we tell you on CG is actually does not compound. It actually is the case that in a world where your parents don't teach it to you, you feel as if you can't actually meet that stereotype because you have the fear that it is going to dehumanize you, that it boils you down to just your ethnicity, and that's harder to do it because every time you get a good grade, you're also feeding a narrative that you only got that good grade because of your ethnicity. On our side, we'd say parents actually break apart the compounding narrative. Right? Parents are able to tell you that you can embrace it and this is a good thing. And it's not in fact bad. It's not just boiled down to that because parents are in a unique position to teach it to you that way. I'll take OO.
Okay, no one on op is saying that children shouldn't get good grades or feel bad about their grades. We're saying that you as a parent have the ability to speak to them, and in doing so, tell them to reject like the inherent problem of stereotypes. And in doing so, you make sure that they don't embrace the parts of the stereotype that literally pit them against other people of color.
Yeah, so here's the problem with that, which is that I already told you how the stereotype is going to exist regardless in the media in a very narrowed scope, and how you as a parent are uniquely able to broaden the scope of it. Every time that op tells you that you have to teach your kid like Asian people are just good at math, that's actually typically not what the stereotype is. The stereotype is usually like you're smarter, but it only gets boiled down when you enable just the media to project what that stereotype is. So you as a parent are actually able to broaden the scope of it, right? That was like the premise of our extension, which like is pointing out the fact that you as a parent are able to explain all the different ways in which the stereotype can fit in. Okay, I want to do some explicit refutation to opening opposition. So opening op, the first thing I'd say is that the majority of their case is this feeds into like anti-blackness and like white supremacy. So a few responses. The first thing I'll say is that this is predicated on this being the only way to break down white supremacy. I would note here, look at your flow. OO never once gives a mechanism for how when this stops, white supremacy gets broken down. So a few things that I'd say. First is that I don't think that this is necessarily the only thing that feeds into the existence of it, right? Without this, there's still going to be negative stereotypes against people, and white people are still going to do whatever they can to like pitch themselves at the top. So it's unclear that your coalition building is going to be the tipping point in breaking this down. The second thing I'd say is it doesn't actually be comparative as OO says. So you don't need to say just because you are smart and Asian that you're comparatively smarter than everyone else and no one else is smart. Just look like Black Lives Matter, for example, right? This is a narrative that pushes positivity on Black people, but isn't saying that other like people of color are intrinsically immoral people, and doesn't break down coalitions, right? Like Black Lives Matter is supported by a large coalition of like many like indigenous people as well, and to tell you that like that's not necessarily something that needs to be hierarchical in nature in order to get the benefits. So that's largely why OO falls, because they don't prove the link on breaking it down, but secondly, because they have a mischaracterization on the way that this works. In terms of anything I left to like CO, I tell you that in general, if their first point is true, that you can ask your kids what you want to do, and their second point is also true, they're going to be a tiger parent, it probably means it's going to be bad in the first place. But we just tell you how largely we expand the scope to which you can teach your kids positive attributes. You enable them to fulfill them, and we fill in the missing link from OG of why parents are uniquely a good actor. Proud to stand on CG.
Okay, thank you very much. Now to the final speaker of this debate, to the OpWhip.
Sajid, can you mute yourself first, because you're not muted. Yeah. All right, I'll start in, I'm not audible, right? Yeah. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So what I'm going to do in this speech is first engage with opening up pen, then engage with closing up pen, and then weigh ourselves against opening opposition to show you why we're first in this debate. So starting with opening government. And like, if you look at the case, a large part of it starts with the fact that you need to be comfortable with your own identity, which is to say that if you as an Asian American want to feel comfortable with your identity, given that it is an oppressed identity to begin with, if you embrace positive stereotypes, that goes a bit in embracing that part of the identity. However, there is no analysis as to why this is true for everyone, which is to say that obviously there are certain positive stereotypes that are attached to every identity, whether it be Indian American, Asian American, etc., etc. Sajid already gave you analysis as to why that doesn't apply to a lot of the people, and even in a lot of cases, even the majority, because to a large extent, if you are indeed like smart, etc., you're probably like very low percentage of these people are likely to attain success in those fields. In those instances, CEO's analysis is very crucial here. Because if you feel like an outsider within your own community because you couldn't fulfill the expectations of that stereotype, you even feel more neglected by your identity. Which is to say that if you are indeed an Asian American who end up fulfilling those expectations, then you feel like you have failed to do something for your community. This is particularly harmful because if you feel distance from your own identity, then in a world that is so hard for minorities, it's even worse, because at least if you could internalize your identity, you would feel good about it, and it gives you the strength to fight problems within the outside world. Secondly, there was this weird analysis as to, like, when asking a POI, and I think this totally destroys their case, which is to say that society enforces it anyways. So what is the harm if parents enforce it, without any analysis as to what the parental angle adds to it? Obviously, that's where CG comes in, and I'll add to that later on. But given that OG did not do this, this is absolutely crucial to show that given that they did not analysis the parent bit, their case actually makes no sense. Thirdly, the only thing that's left is social change. We say that raw interactions, etc., often can lead to social change through fulfilling this positive minority expectations. Let's understand this. In a lot of instances, let's say that this is the path to path to integration for a lot of minorities, which is to say that if you are indeed better, if you are a genius Asian American in Silicon Valley, for example, that leads to positive social clout for your community. This already exists to the extent to which, because positive stereotypes, yes, have made it easier for certain minorities to climb up the ladders in certain industries. So whether it be African Americans and basketball, whether it be doctors and Asian Americans and them being community leaders in those places, means that parents not doubling down upon it still gives you to a large extent some benefits. We say that if you are indeed belonging to a social group, you do have some clout regardless. So even if that is true, then social change can still occur under our world, and it can still happen through the path that OG claims. I'm not sure what the parental angle adds to that. So before I move on, I'll take a POI from OG.
Offbench has presented a lot of alternative characterizations of what minority children should do, and that these might be better. Even if you believe every word of Off, the whole point of the OG is that they will be less likely to be successful at exactly those goals unless they also fulfill positive stereotypes given by society. This turns all of Off.
Not really, right? Like let's just assume for a moment that if you are an Asian painter and you don't have a lot of clout within, say, the art industry, then you will fail, right? What is really better? And there is no analysis from Duff to suggest that if you are indeed an artist, then you should still pursue a traditional career path as an Asian American, just because you're more likely to be successful, foregoing all of the fulfillment that you could have gotten. Even if you are a subpar artist who couldn't make it within that industry, you could still be an artist, which is more important to you. And for some people, just becoming that is more important than attaining success in any other industry. Why success is the most important metric for fulfillment has not been explained by OG, so they are out. All right, going to closing government. Now, what closing government adds here is that because stereotypes are presented in a worse way within society, and parents can do well to subtly shape it in a way that's not bad for them, that's not bad for children, that's pretty good. Here's where our extension, the first extension, really kicks in. Because what you need to notice with stereotypes and cultural norms in a lot of cases is, these, even though a lot of people have good intentions attached to them, they're not manifested in the best way. And by the way, their only analysis to suggest why parents will be good is because, oh, they're parents, and therefore they should be good because they have the best interests of the children at heart, without any sophisticated analysis as to why parents belonging to certain social groups may act in certain ways because of cultural norms that are pre-existing, and therefore double down on that narrative and ultimately be bad for them. And why is this particularly true? Because in a lot of instances, when you look at certain positive stereotypes, for example, being smart, being studious, hardworking, etc., they do come from certain cultural norms that are not particularly very, they're not particularly very allowing of minority children to be able to self-express themselves in the best way possible. So, for example, this whole stereotype existing within Chinese immigrants or Bangladeshi immigrants or Indian immigrants within within all the Western countries means that in a lot of instances, what they feel is a source of entitlement that is attached to that positive stereotype. So, for example, if your Asian parents want you to become a doctor, they want you to become a doctor because they're risk averse, being a first-generation immigrant, because they believe that within their own community it is a metric for you to become a doctor and therefore achieve success. It's because of the fact that they want the compensation for the sacrifices that they've made. All the analysis that Sajid already gave you. In those instances, this becomes more of an expectation as opposed to a complex, subtle norm that can be navigated through, like through some understanding by the parents. Because of the simple reason that these own parents have enough agency within themselves to be able to shape these norms in the most perfect way possible, like Closing Government explains. And Closing Government literally has no analysis to back that up. And in those instances, we think that it's more likely to be a complex double downing of the narrative. So these narratives already exist in the world, and this is just going to be doubled down by the parents. Before I move on, I'm closing up.
Okay, so your response to our case is just saying that anytime parents teach anything, all those harms will exist. This is like non-comparative, right? We'd say that uniquely when parents choose to encourage their kids to do something, they should encourage them to do the thing that countervails existing stereotypes in the media and opens them up to more freedoms. It enables them to reap the benefits of these positive narratives and enables them to broaden the scope of what their stereotype means.
Okay, I'll make this extremely easy for you to understand. Imagine that you are a minority parent, and there is a pop culture expectation and narrative existing within society for you. There's also a greater pressure from your own community to conform to those stereotypes because these already exist as forms of things like tiger parenting, etc., in those communities. What is the countervailing mechanism that is so unique within you that makes you go against all of these forces that are existing? Because parents are also human beings who are shaped by social, cultural narratives that exist both within their community and outside their community. It's not like their communities have the best version of these stereotypes internalized within themselves. If all of this is true, then why will parents suddenly become this magical, the magical godparent that CG wants them to become? The other thing that CG brought is stereotype threats, and that's particularly problematic because, these norms are bad. But they also say that these norms are somewhat positively entailed, so I'm not sure as to how big that stereotype threat is. We say that getting good grades already has positivity attached to them within society. Not sure why that stereotype threat is particularly bad for Asian American kids. Lastly, weighing out with O, because O in a lot of cases wanted to claim that this is particularly bad for certain communities in the way in which they interact. We tell you that in case of mechanizing the impact, the most important point in this particular instance is probably the idea of the right-wing media interpreting it in a wrong way and therefore it flipping out like certain communities. We say that Asians become being nerds is something that is flipped on, and if the community does it bad, then right-wing media is just going to double down upon it. We're entirely proud to force.